Hey guys, good evening, or maybe a gentle good morning, wherever you are in this big, wide world. Tonight, we're going to gently journey back in time. We're heading far from your comfy bed, miles away from those super clean, bright hospital rooms, and all that amazing medical tech. We're diving into a past world, even though it's super old, was totally vital for keeping us all going. It's a world where the very air you breathe and the ground you walked on held secrets our modern minds can barely grasp. Just take a quiet moment and think about your normal day. Perhaps your alarm clock is a gentle hum, easing you awake, or you love the deep, comforting warmth of your blanket and the crisp, clean feel of your sheet. You get out of bed onto a clean floor. The air feels fresh and smells great. You know, if you or someone you care about needed a doctor right now, helps just a call away. They'd be there in minutes, armed with knowledge and tools that seem like magic. You have clean, potable water flowing freely from your tap, super sterile places for medical care, and that quiet confidence from hundreds of years of accumulated science and technological advancement. Doesn't that sound incredibly peaceful? Almost impossibly secure. Okay, now let all that melt away. Instead, picture yourself back in time, not at some fun, romantic medieval fair, but into a dimly lit, humble, and often unsanitary little hut where life was a constant, grinding struggle for sheer survival. The very air inside would be thick with the pervasive smell of wood smoke that stung your eyes, mixed with damp earth and a subtle, lingering hint of unseen dangers that cause, and a subtle, lingering hint of unseen dangers, well, a deep to gnawing panic. Imagine waking up in the pre dawn chill to the sounds of animals stirring outside and the faint, acrid scent of manure wafting in. There's no running water, just a bucket from a nearby, often contaminated, Wellston. No proper sanitation beyond a hole in the ground or a chamber pot, emptied into the street, and the chilling understanding that a simple cough could quickly escalate into a deadly fever. A scraped knee could mean a fatal infection. This, my friends, was the everyday reality of simply existing in medieval times. It was a life so profoundly different from our comfortable existence that someone from our time would simply not last a single day. Before we gently get into all those tough realities, the super limited knowledge, and the truly scary risks people faced, if you find these quiet history trips relaxing and helpful for falling asleep, a little tap on that like button or a quick subscribe would honestly mean so much. It helps more people find these calm journeys into the past. And feel free to share in the comments below where you're listening from. It's always nice to know we're all quietly discovering this together, perhaps gently drifting off as we do. So, with that, time to dim the lights, maybe turn on a soft fan for some soothing background noise, or just listen to the gentle rhythm of the rain outside. Let's drift together into the super interesting, but maybe a little bit unsettling, realities of life in medieval Europe. Sweet dreams, and let's start our quiet trip into a forgotten day that you almost certainly wouldn't survive. The unyielding realities of medieval life. The rhythms of life and rest, constant discomfort. The very cadence of existence in medieval Europe diverged sharply from our contemporary norms, particularly concerning sleep and daily labor. Without the pervasive influence of artificial light and the rigid schedules of industrial society, life was dictated by natural rhythms. the rise and fall of the sun, the subtle shifts of the seasons. This demanded a profound adjustment from any modern transplant, an adjustment that would quickly lead to a deep sense of regret for lost comfort. One of the most striking differences in medieval life was the prevalent sleep pattern, known as biphasic or segmented sleep. Unlike the consolidated 8-hour block we pursue in industrialized societies today, pre industrial Europeans typically experienced two distinct phases of sleep, separated by a period of wakefulness. Imagine the quiet of the early evening, the sun having just dipped below the horizon, casting long, fading shadows across the landscape. You would commonly retire shortly after sunset, often between 8 and 9 p.m., for a first sleep lasting approximately 3 to 3.5 hours. Your crude straw mattress, perhaps covered by a thin, coarse wool blanket, would feel lumpy and unyielding beneath you. The air in your humble home would still carry the faint, lingering smell of the day's cooking fire mixed with the earthy dampness of the packed dirt floor. Following this initial slumber, a period of wakefulness, referred to as the watch, would naturally ensue, lasting anywhere from 1 to 3 hours. This wasn't a struggle with insomnia or a restless mind. It was simply how people slept. There was no bright, intrusive electric light to disrupt the natural rhythm of the night. Instead, the darkness would be profound, broken only by the faint glow of embers in the hearth or the soft, flickering light of a rush lamp you might have prepared earlier. The quiet sounds of the household would shift from the deep snores of tired bodies to the gentle rustle of straw as someone else also woke, or the soft murmur of a hushed conversation from across the single room. This segmented sleep pattern was not a mere quirk of medieval Europeans. It was a normal and widespread practice across pre industrial societies globally, with historical references extending back to ancient texts. Evidence of biphasic sleep has been found on virtually every continent, save Antarctica. The uniformity of this pattern across diverse cultures and millennia suggests that it might actually represent a more fundamental or natural human sleep rhythm and adaptive behavior that perhaps allowed individuals to remain alert during vulnerable nighttime hours, reducing the risk of predators or other dangers. During the watch, people engaged in a variety of activities that were integral to their daily lives and social fabric. These weren't necessarily exciting endeavors, but practical household tasks that unfolded in the quiet hush of the night. You might find yourself adding logs to the smoldering fire, the subtle crackling and fresh scent of wood smoke momentarily filling the room. Perhaps you'd be peeling rushes for candles, the dry, fibrous sound a soft counterpoint to the distant hoot of an owl, or even brewing beer, the earthy, yeasty aroma slowly permeating the cool night air. Farmers might use this time to check on their livestock, stepping out into the crisp, healing, really soft breathing of cattle or the gentle rustle of chickens in their coops, ensuring their safety or preparing for the next day's labor. It was also a period for more personal and social interaction. Husbands and wives would often use this quiet, sacred time for intimate conversation and closeness, fostering a deeper connection away from the relentless demands and constant scrutiny of the day. Religious devotions played a significant role as well, with devout Christians often dedicating this peaceful hour to prayer and quiet meditation, seeking solace in spiritual reflection in the stillness of the night. Scholars and poets also found this uninterrupted nocturnal interval exceptionally conducive to writing, their quills scratching softly on parchment by the faint light of a candle, their thoughts flowing freely in the undisturbed quiet. For a modern individual, the expectation of continuous, uninterrupted sleep is deeply ingrained into our very being, and consequently, experiencing a natural nocturnal awakening, as was common in medieval times, would likely be perceived as a genuine sleep disorder, leading to immediate anxiety and a frantic struggle to return to rest. The lack of modern day distractions, no smartphones to scroll through, no endless television shows to binge, no internet to browse, would mean a modern person would completely lack the cultural framework and practical tasks to meaningfully fill the watch period. This would potentially lead to intense boredom, profound restlessness, or a frustrating sense of wasted time. The medieval integration of night into daily life, including quiet reflection and spiritual focus, contrasts sharply with the utilitarian view of sleep in our industrialized world, where it is primarily seen as mere fuel for the next day's productivity. This fundamental difference in the very rhythm of existence would be a deep and constant source of discomfort, making even the simple act of sleeping a surprising regret. The relentless grind, work and precarious sustenance. Beyond the rhythms of rest, the daily grind in medieval Europe was characterized by relentless physical labor and a direct, often precarious, link to sheer sustenance. Imagine a world where your very survival depended directly on the strength of your back and the fertility of the soil. The vast majority of the population were farming peasants, their lives entirely dictated by the agrarian calendar and the unwavering cycles of the sun and seasons. Workdays for these peasants were long and arduous, often commencing as early as 3 a.m. in the summer, when the first faint streaks of light barely touched the eastern sky, and concluding at dusk, when the air grew chill and the landscape faded into deep shadows. Though these long hours were often interspersed with breaks for simple meals and customary afternoon naps, perhaps a brief slumber under the shade of a tree as the sun beat down on the fields, the fundamental purpose of their labor remained constant to grow enough food for their own survival. You would spend most of your waking hours cultivating your assigned strips of land, feeling the rough, splintered wood of the plow handle in your calloused hands, the rich, damp smell of turned earth filling your nostrils with every rhythmic step. This subsistence based existence meant that a bad harvest could directly lead to profound hunger and widespread famine, highlighting the constant precariousness of life. You would live with a constant season in the pit of your stomach, watching the sky for signs of too much rain or not enough, knowing that the whims of nature directly impacted whether your family would eat tomorrow or even next season. Peasant households were largely self sufficient, producing their own food and crafting their own goods, from simple wooden tools to rough linen clothes. Larger tasks, like the building of a new hut or the repair of a communal barn, were often accomplished through collective effort, the sounds of hammering and shared song echoing through the fields. The sweat would prickle on your skin as you heaved heavy timbers, the satisfaction of a day's communal work settling like a warm ache in your muscles as the sun finally set. For artisans and urban dwellers, life in towns was crowded, noisy, and often deeply unsanitary. Picture the narrow, winding streets, often muddy and uneven, teeming with people, carts, and animals. The air would be a complex smell of chimney soot, raw sewage, often just dumped from upper windows, horse manure, and the faint, sweetish odor of brewing ale or tanning leather. Livelihoods were earned as merchants or craftsmen, with work hours generally spanning from sunrise to sunset. The rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the insistent cries of street vendors hawking their wares, and the distant, muffled sounds of someone singing or arguing would form the constant soundtrack of your work. The clean, however, even in these urban settings, the workday was punctuated by mid-morning and mid-afternoon refreshment breaks, and a significant 2-hour midday pause for lunch and a nap. These were not luxuries but necessities for endurance in a world without mechanical assistance or artificial light to extend the day. Religious holidays were also numerous, providing significant periods of leisure, potentially accounting for up to one-third of the year in places like medieval England. These breaks would offer a welcome respite from the physical exertion, a chance to stretch aching muscles and momentarily escape the pervasive smells and sounds of the bustling town. For a modern individual, accustomed to specialized labor and readily available consumer goods at the mere click of a button, you would be profoundly unprepared for the direct, physical demands of medieval work. The constant, immediate link between one's physical labor and their very survival would be an overwhelming burden. Imagine the feeling of your muscles aching after a day of chopping wood for warmth or grinding grain into flour for bread, knowing that if you didn't do it, there would be no food or warmth for your family. The lack of modern machinery means that even basic tasks, such as heating water for a bath, a rare luxury anyway, required immense physical effort and precious time. The physical stamina, the deeply practical skills like farming, crafting, animal husbandry, and the sheer mental resilience required for such a subsistence based existence are largely absent in our contemporary lives. The pervasive anxiety over food security and the constant threat of famine, a concept largely unfamiliar to most in developed nations today, would impose a severe and persistent psychological. You would find yourself living with a primal fear that we rarely, if ever, encounter. This relentless grind, combined with the ever present threat of hunger, would swiftly make you regret your venture into medieval times. A life of sickness and suffering, the body's constant battle. Beyond the rhythms of work and rest, the very physical environment and the state of human health in medieval times presented challenges that would quickly and utterly overwhelm a modern person, leading to profound regret over the simplest ailments. Imagine a world where every cough, every sneeze, every minor cut carried the potential for catastrophic consequences. Life in medieval Europe was characterized by a pervasive fragility, marked by extremely high mortality rates and significantly shorter lifespans. It is estimated that only 1 in 10 adults live to be as old as 50, with a devastating number of babies, children, and teenagers succumbing to illness. Infectious diseases were rampant and deadly, including dysentery, malaria, diphtheria, flu, typhoid, smallpox, and leprosy. The era was punctuated by regular waves of pestilence or plague, culminating in the catastrophic Black Death, bubonic plague of 1348, 1349, which wiped out nearly half the population of Britain and swept across Europe, leaving widespread devastation in its wake. Famine often followed these disease outbreaks, further exacerbating the death toll. The constant, chilling presence of death would be a daily companion, a cold breath on your neck that you could never truly shake. Medieval medical understanding was rudimentary by modern standards, deeply rooted in the ancient Greek tradition of humoral theory. This theory posited that the human body was composed of four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, which were believed to be controlled by the four elements of fire, water, earth, and air. Disease, therefore, was believed to result from an imbalance of these humors. Imagine the bewildering logic of trying to diagnose an illness based on whether your humors were too hot or too cold, too wet or too dry. Illnesses were frequently interpreted as divine punishment for sins, adding a heavy, moralistic layer to every ache and pain. Suffering was widely accepted as an unavoidable part of the human condition. Consequently, medicine was deeply intertwined with superstition and faith, with prescriptions sometimes taking the form of prayers. Diagnostic methods were severely limited to simple observation, palpation, the feeling of the body, feeling the pulse, and, most commonly, the examination of urine, the color of which was used to diagnose ailment. Imagine a doctor peering intently at a flask of your urine, its various shades of yellow and cloudiness, holding the mysterious key to your perceived affliction. The smell, too, would be keenly observed, contributing to the enigmatic diagnosis. Common remedies and treatments often seem unsettling to us now. These included bloodletting, often performed using leeches, their cold, slimy bodies attaching to your skin, or by making small cuts into a vein to drain what was believed to be excess or corrupted blood. Cupping, where heated cups were applied to the skin to create suction and draw out bad humors, was also common. Various purgatives were administered, foul tasting concoctions designed to induce vomiting or diarrhea, aimed at expelling perceived imbalances within the body. Diet was also considered a crucial aspect of maintaining health, with certain foods recommended or avoided based on their presumed effect on the humors. Most ordinary people rarely, if ever, encountered a formally trained physician, those erudite men steeped in Latin texts and humoral theory. Instead, they relied on local wise women, or sometimes men skilled in herbal remedies, priests who might attempt to exorcise evil spirits, or barbers who performed a range of surgical procedures, from pulling teeth to setting broken bones. Imagine the rough, calloused hands of a barber surgeon, smelling faintly of blood and perhaps cheap ale, as he prepared to extract your aching tooth. While some herbal remedies from this period are still recognized for their efficacy today, and medieval surgeons achieved surprising success with procedures like setting broken bones and sealing wounds, often using egg whites or old wine to prevent infection. The overall medical knowledge was severely limited by modern standards. Anesthetics like alcohol or mandragora were used to dull pain, but their effects were often unreliable and temporary. The pervasive threat of illness and the chilling lack of control over one's own health would be profoundly overwhelming for a modern individual. Accustomed to advanced medical care, widespread vaccination, and the remarkable efficacy of antibiotics, the constant, visible threat of deadly, often untreatable diseases would fundamentally alter your entire sense of personal safety. The knowledge that a simple infection, something easily curable today with a quick trip to the doctor and a prescription, could be a swift and agonizing death sentence would induce extreme, persistent fear and crushing anxiety. The absence of a scientific understanding of germs meant that preventative measures were largely unknown or woefully ineffective. The reliance on faith and superstition for healing would clash starkly with our contemporary scientific understanding, leaving a modern person feeling utterly helpless and hopeless in the face of illness. The commonality of death, particularly among children, would be an emotionally devastating reality that few modern individuals are prepared to confront on a daily basis. You would find yourself grieving constantly, and the sheer volume of loss would leave a heavy, permanent mark on your spirit. The ineffectiveness of medieval medical paradigms, despite their systematic nature, like humoral theory, would further compound the challenges. A modern person would find the diagnostic methods, like staring at urine or feeling pulses, and treatments such as extensive bloodletting that weaken the patient further, bizarre and utterly unscientific. The concept of balancing humors through purging or specific diets would seem primitive and deeply frustrating. Even successful surgical interventions would carry immense risks due to the complete absence of sterile practices and truly effective pain management, making the experience of seeking any care deeply unsettling and untrustworthy from a modern perspective. This constant battle against unseen enemies and misunderstood ailments would be a profound and continuous source of regret. The unsanitized world, hygiene and living conditions. Now, let's step into the medieval environment itself, a world characterized by a pervasive lack of sanitation and an almost complete absence of privacy, creating living conditions that would be profoundly challenging and deeply regrettable for a modern individual. Prepare yourself for a sensory experience that would test the limits of your contemporary sensibilities. Personal hygiene practices, while present in some form, were rudimentary by today's standards. Most people were expected to perform topping and tailing daily, which meant washing the face, underarms, and nether regions. But full body bathing was certainly not a regular occurrence. When bathing did happen, it was often a weekly event in communal bathhouses, which also served as bustling social hubs, or perhaps in nearby rivers. Imagine the distinct, complex smell of a communal bathhouse, a mix of human bodies, damp wood, stale steam, and perhaps a faint, earthy scent of the river water itself. Even teeth cleaning was basic, using implements like chewed hazel twigs or linen cloths, sometimes with abrasive substances like sea salt and ground herbs, such as cloves. Picture the rough, slightly gritty texture of salt against your gums, followed by the sharp, aromatic burst of cloves. Combs were universally used to manage hair and remove parasites, which were a constant concern. You would regularly feel the maddening itch of unseen tiny creatures on your scalp and body, a persistent, low level irritation that was simply part of everyday life. Laundry was performed regularly using soap made from ashes and animal fat, with clothes often beaten to remove dirt. The pungent, greasy smell of lye soap would be a familiar companion on washing days. A fundamental aspect of medieval life was the pervasive lack of privacy. The modern concept of personal space was virtually non existent. Living spaces were typically multi purpose and communal. It was common for entire families, along with servants, guests, and even strangers, to share a single bed. In grand residences during the early medieval period, much of the household would sleep communally in the great hall on blankets or cloaks laid over rushes or rush mat. Even in wealthier homes, if a family had more than one bed, children might sleep on a mattress on the floor or in another bed in the same room as their parent. Personal matters, including sleeping, eating, and attending to bodily functions, frequently occurred in the presence of others, sometimes even alongside farm animals. Imagine the constant, inescapable presence of other bodies and their sounds and smells, with no door to close for true solitude. Housing structures varied by social class, but universally lacked modern amenities. Peasant homes were typically small huts constructed from mud and sticks known as wattle and daub, or rough-hewn stones, with thatched roofs, usually comprising only one or two rooms. For warmth and safety, livestock such as cows, geese, and hens were often brought inside and shared living quarters with the family, contributing to profoundly unhygienic conditions. The earthy, musky smell of animal dung and straw would mingle with the pervasive smoke from the central hearth. In castles and grand houses, the great hall served as a communal sleeping area for most inhabitants. Windows were generally unglazed, offering minimal insulation or privacy, and wood fires burned on central hearths without chimneys, filling interiors with smoke and making breathing difficult. Your lungs would constantly feel a subtle coating of soot, and your eyes would often water from the persistent irritation. Sanitation posed immense challenges. Towns lacked centralized sewage systems, with waste commonly discarded directly into streets or local rivers. The sight and smell of human and animal waste in the gutters would be a constant, sickening reality. Outdoor privies or chamber pots were widespread, and their contents were often emptied into nearby water sources, leading to significant contamination. Water sources like streams, rivers, and wells were easily polluted by animal and human waste, as well as industrial processes such as fulling, cleaning newly woven cloth with a mixture that included urine. While some efforts were made to separate drinking water from other uses, contamination remained a persistent problem. The dull, slightly metallic taste of impure water would be a daily reminder of the ever present danger of disease. Pests such as fleas and lice were ubiquitous, with medieval people believing they spontaneously generated from dirt. Measures to deter them included wearing repellents like lavender and cedarwood, or hanging clothes near smoky fires. The constant, maddening itch of unseen parasites would be an ever present, irritating sensation on your skin. The psychological burden of this pervasive lack of privacy would be a profound shock for a modern individual. Contemporary society places immense value on personal space and solitude. The constant, unavoidable proximity to others, from communal sleeping arrangements to public bodily functions, would be deeply unsettling, leading to chronic stress, anxiety, and a feeling of perpetual exposure. This environment would make personal reflection, relaxation, and even basic self care activities challenging, potentially leading to significant mental distress. The cultural norms around nudity and shared spaces in medieval bathhouses would also represent a considerable cultural barrier. Furthermore, daily life in medieval times would present a continuous sensory overload and environmental threat. The unsanitary conditions, characterized by pervasive odors from waste, poor air quality from indoor fires, and the omnipresence of insects and rodents, would create an environment physically and mentally intolerable for someone accustomed to modern cleanliness standards. The constant exposure to such conditions would not only be disgusting, but would also pose immediate and severe health risks. The sheer effort required for basic hygiene, such as boiling water for drinking, would be a daily struggle, highlighting the vast difference in living standards. You would constantly feel a film of grime on your skin, the pervasive smells clinging to your clothes and hair, and the quiet dread of invisible threats in every breath. Navigating a brutal society, lack of rights, and constant peril. Beyond the physical environment, the social and legal frameworks of medieval Europe would present an entirely alien and often perilous landscape for a modern individual leading to deep regret over lost freedoms and safety. Imagine navigating a world where your personal autonomy was largely dictated by your birth, and your every action was governed by a rigid hierarchy that offered little room for individual ambition or escape. Medieval European society was rigidly structured by a sharply hierarchical feudal system, where an individual status was largely inherited and inextricably linked to land ownership. At the apex was the king, who theoretically owned all land, which he then parceled out to nobles in exchange for loyalty and service. These nobles, in turn, granted access to land to their vassals, who might be knights or other lesser nobles, and ultimately to peasants. Each level within this hierarchy owed specific services, military, labor, or produce, to the one above it. This system, while providing a degree of political stability, meant that the vast majority of the population, the peasants, lived and died under the direct control of their noble lords, possessing very limited individual rights or social mobility. Imagine the constant, dull weight of knowing that your life's path was essentially predetermined from birth, that even your children's future was bound to the same plot of land, serving the same Lord. The faint smell of damp earth from the fields would cling to you, a persistent reminder of your rooted, inescapable existence. Social interactions were governed by strict rules of courtesy and deportment, adherence to which was paramount, and deviation could lead to severe social or even physical consequences. Children were rigorously taught proper behavior from a young age through courtesy books, which dictated everything from how to dress and walk to how to eat and speak. Imagine the constant vigilance required to avoid a misstep, the subtle tension in every social interaction, especially with those of higher rank. Specific rules applied to interactions with social superiors, such as never addressing them first and maintaining direct eye contact, which was seen as a sign of honesty. Public displays of affection were considered inappropriate, and women of good breeding were generally not expected to venture out alone. The very act of walking through the village, feeling the muddy, uneven ground beneath your feet, would be accompanied by a subtle awareness of every gaze, every potential judgment. The modern individual's deeply ingrained emphasis on personal freedom, individual rights, and meritocracy would clash dramatically with the rigid, inherited social hierarchy and collective identity that defined medieval life. The very concept of individual rights was often secondary to the needs of the family or clan. For instance, in some societies like that of the samurai, women were frequently regarded as tools for the longevity of the house, with their lives often ordered by male superiors. The lack of social mobility, the expectation of subservience, and the severe consequences for nonconformity, for example, family dishonor or the risk of seppuku, ritual suicide, for men if women were not properly submissive, would impose an immense psychological burden. A modern person would find the lack of personal autonomy, particularly in fundamental matters like marriage, deeply oppressive and would likely struggle to comprehend or accept their prescribed place within such a stratified society. The heavy, invisible chains of societal expectation would chafe at your spirit, leading to a constant, low level frustration that would never quite fade. This pervasive lack of control over your own destiny and the brutal consequences for any attempt at deviation would be a deep and continuous source of regret for anyone from our time. The midwife's specific burdens. While the general societal constraints and physical hardships of medieval life were immense for everyone, for a medieval midwife, these challenges were amplified and colored by the unique, intimate, and often dangerous nature of her profession. Imagine stepping into a role that placed you at the very threshold of life and death, wielding profound responsibility with only the most rudimentary tools and knowledge. This was a burden that a modern person would find utterly unbearable. In the Middle Ages, when a new life was preparing to arrive, it was almost always considered women's business. That's just how it was. Male doctors, with their fancy medical books and Latin phrases, usually stayed away. They often worried about scandalous rumors or just saw dealing with women's bodies as a bit beneath them, preferring to focus on intellectual discussions rather than the messy, physical reality of childbirth. Guys only got involved in really dire emergencies, or if it was a royal birth and some surgical tools were absolutely necessary. So, right from the start, this created a unique, but also pretty shaky, space for women in healthcare, setting the scene for all the tough stuff they'd face. Imagine, for a moment, being a medieval midwife. There's no shift schedule, no clocking in or out. You are, quite simply, always on call. Always. The sun might have just set, and you've finally settled down for a few precious hours of sleep after a long day of caring for your own family, perhaps spinning wool or mending clothes by the flickering firelight. The sounds of the village are quieting down, maybe a distant dog bark, the gentle rustle of wind through thatched roofs, and the rhythmic chirping of cricket. You're almost drifting off, the rough straw mattress feeling surprisingly soft after a day on your feet. But then it happens, a sharp, insistent rap on your wooden door. Not a polite knock, but an urgent, almost desperate pounding. Your heart leaps into your throat. You know instantly what it means. Someone is in labor. Right next to it, you quickly pull on your thick, coarse wool tunic, feeling the biting cold seep into your bones from the cracks in the walls. The air inside your humble home is damp, carrying the lingering smell of last night's cooking fire and the earthy scent of the packed dirt floor. You grab your small satchel, already feeling the familiar weight of your simple tools and a quiet sense of dread mixed with purpose. Stepping outside, the night air hits you like a physical blow. It's often damp and cold, sometimes carrying the complex smell of chimney soot from 100 other tiny hearths, mixed with raw sewage and horse manure that permeates every corner of the medieval town. There's no street lighting, only the faint glow of the moon, or perhaps a few flickering lanterns carried by your frantic escort. The muddy, dirty streets squelch beneath your worn boots, and you have to pick your way carefully to avoid tripping over refuse or slipping in a fresh puddle. This isn't just discomfort, it's a constant physical challenge even before you reach the birthing chamber. Midwives were absolutely central to medieval community life. They weren't just there for the actual birth. They were primary caregivers for newborns and often helped women with general health issues too. People really valued them, so much so that some midwives even got special perks, like not having to pay certain taxes or getting small pensions. Pretty neat for a medieval woman, right? But here's the catch, because their services were so vital, they often couldn't just pack up and leave their village or city. Their community needed them, and that was that. And their work didn't end when the baby arrived. Nope, their responsibilities usually lasted for about a month after the birth, which means they were also involved in early postnatal care for both mom and baby. This wasn't just a quick pop in, it was a commitment. The rules for them were clear. They had to be diligent and faithful, and ready to help every woman laboring of child, as well the poor as the rich. Think about that for a second. You couldn't refuse a call, whether it was from the richest lady in the castle or the poorest peasant in a tiny shack. It was 24/7, no exceptions, and you were expected to be equally dedicated to everyone. Now, you had a couple of types of midwives back then. There were the professional midwives. These were the rare ones who could actually read and sometimes even got their hands on medical texts. They might even volunteer their services sometimes. But most midwives were lay midwives. They couldn't read or write, usually came from poorer families, and learned everything by watching and doing from their moms, grandmas, and older village midwives. These lay midwives were the ones that regular folks in both the countryside and cities relied on most. So, while midwifery did give women a rare chance to have some independence and maybe even move up a bit in society, which was a huge deal in a world pretty much run by men, this professional freedom often came with a big shadow. Religious leaders and male political figures were always a bit suspicious. The church, for example, actually liked that midwives had a public role, especially for things like emergency baptism. If a baby was really sick and seemed like it might not make it, the midwife could baptize it herself to make sure its soul was saved. This was super important. But here's the unsettling part. The church also used midwives as their eyes and ears. They were agents, basically, told to keep an eye on women and report things like illegitimate births or if someone was trying to hide a baby or, horrifyingly, commit infanticide. So, while these women had real, practical power inside the birthing room, their bigger professional freedom was always being watched and controlled by outside animal authority and moral policing. For someone like us today, used to being independent in our jobs and always putting our patients first, this constant tension would be incredibly tough. It'd be a psychological night. Imagine the quiet desperation of a mother whispering secrets to you, the heavy silence of unspoken truths, and that constant, gnawing internal struggle as a midwife. You'd have to decide whether to protect your patient's secret or report it to save yourself. It's a weight that would crush a modern professional. And it wasn't just about babies. Midwives had other important public jobs too. They were legally required to tell the authorities about all sorts of private stuff. Think about it. If a baby was born out of wedlock, they had to question the mom and get the father's name. They had to report premature births and those awful cases of infanticide. They even served as witnesses in rape cases. Pretty heavy stuff, right? From the mid 1500s, and even hinting at earlier times, midwives often had to swear these really long, detailed oaths. These oaths spelled out exactly what they had to do. They had to make sure paternity was accurate, stop fake birth claims, protect the baby from harm, promise not to use witchcraft or unlawful prayers, which, by the way, tells you a lot about the suspicions they faced, charge fair fees, prevent secret deliveries, keep things confidential, unless the law said otherwise, make sure stillborn babies were properly buried, and even report other midwives who were doing a bad job or working without a license. This whole setup, especially with church officials often giving out licenses, meant midwives were directly accountable to the government and the church. They were basically informants, forced to police society's morals and report super intimate details about their patients' lives, like who the real father was, or if a birth was secret. This turned their role, which should have been about trust and closeness, into one of surveillance. For a modern midwife who's trained to put patient privacy and sticking up for them above everything else, this would be a massive ethical nightmare. It's just profoundly challenging and emotionally exhausting. And if they didn't follow these rules, serious trouble. They could lose their independence, their license, and their entire way of making a living. Can you imagine that kind of pressure? Now, let's talk about what these medieval midwives actually knew about the human body, especially women's bodies. And, well, it wasn't much. Medieval medical knowledge was super limited. A huge reason for this was that they just couldn't do human dissections. It was mostly forbidden, or just a big no no culturally. Can you believe even diagrams of the womb in old medical books, even from the late 1100s, were totally abstract? And get this, they weren't even based on human female anatomy. They were based on the anatomy of a pig. Just let that sink in. Imagine being a midwife, feeling your way through a birth with no real idea of what's actually happening inside. It's like trying to fix a complex machine with a blindfold on, relying solely on touch and what you think you know. The profound lack of understanding of the female reproductive system would be terrifying for a modern midwife. Your entire practice today is based on knowing every tiny detail of anatomy, how things work, and what can go wrong. Back then, you'd feel so helpless, so incredibly frustrated. It would be a constant sense of just practicing in the dark, always guessing and hoping for the best. The mental toll of that constant uncertainty must have been immense. And here's another truly mind boggling thing. Medieval people generally had no idea about germ theory. None at all. Diseases were often blamed on miasmas, basically, bad smells or corrupted air from rotting stuff. Or, even deeper, they were seen as punishment from God for sins. Can you imagine that weight? Every illness, every death could be seen as a moral failing. So, imagine the air in that birthing room. It wouldn't just have the smells of wood smoke and damp earth. There would be a thick, sickly sweet odor of decay, a faint metallic tang from illness, and a pervasive mustiness that seemed to cling to every fabric, every surface. This was the air they believed was causing sickness, not tiny, invisible microbes. The idea of washing your hands to actually kill germs? That didn't really become a thing until the mid. For centuries before, if people washed their hands, it was more for religious rituals or just to get the visible dirt off, not because they understood about preventing invisible infections. Sure, some smart folks like Moses ben Mammon, back in 1199, thought hand washing was important in medicine, but again, it was often ceremonial or social, not about microscopic baddies. It, the terrifying part for a modern midwife is this: you're trained in sterile techniques, you know all about microbiology, and strict infection control is literally your life. But in medieval times, you'd be constantly surrounded by invisible microbial threats. Doctors, and remember, men usually avoided birth, but this example still shows the lack of knowledge, would sometimes go straight from dissecting dead bodies to delivering babies without washing their hands. And no one thought anything of it. This directly led to deadly infections like puerperal fever, which even took the lives of queens. Imagine knowing that every time you touched a laboring woman, every time you assisted in the birth, you could unknowingly be bringing death with your own hands. You couldn't see it, couldn't understand it, and couldn't fight it. That constant, unseen microbial threat and the inability to do anything about it would be absolutely horrifying. It would make the work physically and psychologically unbearable due to the constant, unavoidable risk of infection, and the knowledge that you might be inadvertently causing harm. That's a burden we can barely fathom today. So, how did medieval midwives actually learn their craft? Well, forget about going to college or getting some fancy degree. There wasn't any formal education or training like we have today. Their main credentials were usually just how old they were, or if they'd already had several kids of their own. It was all about practical experience, learned mostly by word of mouth from their moms, grandmas, and the older midwives in the village. Think of it as a really informal apprenticeship, hands on learning from a very young age. Future midwives would often just watch births from when they were little kids. Imagine that, spending countless hours observing, listening, and learning through every sense. You'd smell the sweat and blood, hear the sounds of women suffering in the first cries of newborns, and your hands would gradually learn the feel of a laboring body, often through harsh, immediate lessons. It's pretty rare to find books written by women for women in the late Middle Ages. Male doctors, who were the ones writing most of the medical texts, generally just ignored child. They were busy focusing on more important and definitely more profitable problems for men. And get this, women were mostly banned from universities back then, often because students had to take religious vows. So, there was simply no way for them to get any formal medical training or learn from scientific discoveries in an institutional setting. This meant their knowledge was a wild mix. They combined pure superstition with some practical logic and a lot of herbal medicines. For example, they might use birthwort. Imagine its bitter taste and how they hoped it would get contractions going, or wormwood with its sharp, almost acrid scent for pain relief. And then lady's mantle, perhaps you can picture its soft, damp leaves used to try and stop bleeding. This reliance on experience and oral stories did keep midwifery going as a super important, female dominated field for centuries. But the big downside, no formal, standardized education, and women being locked out of academic medical training meant that knowledge piled up really slowly, was very local, and could easily get lost or misunderstood. That's a huge difference from modern medical education, which is all about scientific proof, always learning new things, and sharing the best practices globally. A modern midwife would find relying on unproven practices and having no solid, evolving scientific knowledge deeply unsettling. It would really limit their ability to actually help and understand when things went wrong. Beyond the herbs, midwives and birthing women also put a ton of faith in prayers, charms, and amulets. These weren't just little trinkets. They could be special scrolls of animal skin called birthing girdles that women actually wore during labor. Imagine the feeling of that inscribed vellum against your skin, rough and reassuring, carrying all that quiet hope. Or it might be pieces of coral, shiny lodestones, relics from saints, or specially made amulets. People really believed in their tangible presence and the comfort they might offer. Spells were also used. Good magic was just a part of everyday life, even though the church officially wasn't a fan. They thought the religious power of signs and rituals could be magically used to help heal someone. This extensive use of charms, amulets, and religious rituals, alongside herbal remedies, really shows you how people thought back. The physical world and the spiritual world were totally mixed up when it came to healing and childbirth. This wasn't just superstition in our modern way of thinking. It was their accepted science and medicine. It was a holistic approach to health that completely lacked our modern understanding of cause and effect. For a modern midwife who's trained in a totally science based system where everything has to be proven, dealing with a practice where good results were sometimes just credited to a saint's prayer or a magical object would be a massive cultural and professional shock. Think of the emotional burden of desperately wanting to help but knowing your most powerful tools were essentially hope and a whispered chant. It highlights the huge gap in how they understood the world and the profound emotional strain of relying on things that simply weren't proven. Now, let's step inside the medieval birthing chamber itself. Get ready, because for a modern person, this would be a real shock. In medieval towns were just inherently unhealthy places. You couldn't escape it. The streets commonly filled with garbage and human waste. Seriously, this led to truly terrible smells that were just gap. No, always there. A concoction of damp, rotting food scraps, stale urine, and the pervasive, cloying scent of decomposing organic matter. It clung to everything, permeated your clothes, and felt like it coated the back of your throat. This environment was practically a playground for disease. Houses, often made from wattle and daub, basically woven sticks covered in mud and clay, frequently overhung the narrow streets, blocking out what little light and fresh air there might have been. Inside, rats, lice, and fleas were common house guests, happily living in the rushes that were strewn over the packed clay floors. You'd hear the faint scuttling of tiny feet in the walls at night, feel the constant, maddening itch of unseen parasites on your skin, and the air would always feel heavy, stagnant, and thick with fine dust. Even though some town leaders in the later Middle Ages tried a few things, like building public latrines, having muckrakers clean the streets, and even some bathhouses or quarantine rules, there just wasn't any big improvement in public health overall. Why? Mostly because they just didn't get what caused diseases. Remember that miasma theory? It stuck around for ages. Plus, their waste disposal was terrible. Those public latrines often just dumped everything into rivers, which were then used for cooking and washing, and the sheer amount of trash was just overwhelming. So, the pervasive unsanitary conditions of medieval life meant that creating a clean birthing environment, by today's standards, was literally impossible. You could try your best as a midwife, perhaps washing your hands with some olive oil or herbal concoction, but the world around you was just full of bacteria. The water you used, the communal eating dishes, the air itself. Eulachane, and carried a high bacterial load. A modern midwife who is totally used to sterile fields, universal precautions, and super strict infection control would walk into a medieval birthing room and be absolutely horrified. Every single aspect would feel like a gross violation of basic safety. This constant, unavoidable exposure to pathogens would make the work physically and psychologically unbearable. You'd always know that despite all your efforts, you could be inadvertently causing harm just by existing in that environment. It's a truly chilling thought. All right, let's talk about the tools a medieval midwife had at her disposal. Get ready for a stark contrast to today's high tech equipment. Her kit was incredibly simple, basic, and often well used. She'd carry her supplies in a woven basket or a small satchel. Imagine the rough texture of the wicker or the worn leather against her hand, the weight of it the constant companion. Inside, maybe a wooden tray to keep things somewhat organized. She'd have some linens, likely rough, well washed fabric, probably stiff from line drying in the sun or by a smoky fire. Then, a pair of plain scissors, perhaps a sharp knife for cutting the umbilical cord, and the most important piece of furniture, a birthing stool. Picture a low, sturdy wooden seat with a U shaped opening at the front, maybe chipped and scarred from countless births. Simple, functional, and utterly lacking in any modern comfort or precision. Now for the truly unsettling part, the interventions. When things went wrong, which they often did, medieval midwives had to resort to methods that would seem brutal and utterly horrifying to us today. For a swollen belly that they hoped would speed up delivery, they might rub on an ointment made from fennel. Imagine the strong, licorice like scent filling the close air, the slick feel of the oil as they worked it into the skin, hoping against hope it would somehow help. They would also perform internal examinations to check how things were progressing, using fresh butter or other oils to help assess cervical dilation and try to stretch the opening for the baby. Think of the tactile sensation, the greasy feel of the butter, the midwife's fingers probing, the sheer physical invasiveness of it all, with no pain relief for the laboring mother, beyond perhaps a sip of wine or some herbal concoction. But things got really intense if the baby was in an unnatural presentation, basically, in the wrong position. The midwife would anoint her hands with wild thyme oil. Perhaps you can imagine its earthy, slightly pungent aroma mixing with the other smells of the room, and then she would try to manually turn or rearrange the baby inside the womb. This was done entirely without modern medicine. No scans to guide her, just her hands and intuition. Imagine the mother's screams, raw and piercing, the midwife's straining muscles, the horrifying sensation of forcing life into the right position. It's a vivid, agonizing image that speaks volumes about the sheer physical brutality of these necessary interventions. And if the baby was stuck, oh, the methods they used. They included physically shaking the woman, lifting her, or drastically repositioning her. Picture a midwife and perhaps her female assistants physically jarring a laboring woman, trying to use gravity or sheer force to dislodge a baby. You'd hear the heavy gasps of the mother, perhaps the creak of the floorboards under the exertion, and feel the reverberations through her very body. It's a truly desperate measure when no other options exist. Forceps, those crucial modern tools for difficult births, simply didn't exist until the 1600s. This absence meant that medieval midwives had to rely on these extreme physical measures, often with heartbreaking results. After the birth, if all went well, the midwife would then tie and cut the umbilical cord. Typically, they'd leave it about 4 fingers length. Then, the new little one would be bathed, likely in water that was far from pristine, rubbed with salt. Imagine the sting, the raw feel of it on tender newborn skin, and then honey would be put on their palate and gums to try and stimulate their appetite. For a modern midwife, trained in advanced surgical interventions, gentle pain management, and the delicate handling of both mother and child, these medieval methods would be barbaric, deeply distressing, and potentially traumatizing. You'd feel immense physical and psychological toll practicing in such conditions. The only options were often crude and painful, and the knowledge that you couldn't offer anything better must have been a constant, heavy weight. It's a profound thought, isn't it? Small joys and unseen legacy. Amidst all the overwhelming demands, the pervasive dangers, and the constant presence of suffering that defined medieval life, there were, perhaps, fleeting moments of small joys and profound satisfaction. These weren't grand, celebrated triumphs in the modern sense, but quiet, deeply personal respites that allowed the human spirit to endure. Think of the sheer miracle of a successful birth, particularly from the perspective of a medieval midwife. After hours, sometimes days, of intense labor, of grappling with unseen complications and the ever present threat of infection, the arrival of a healthy, squalling newborn must have been a powerful, redeeming. Hearing that first strong cry, sharp and insistent, cutting through the tense silence of the birthing room, would be a sound of pure, undeniable triumph. Feeling the tiny, warm body take its first deep breath, its delicate lungs expanding, and seeing the look of exhausted relief and overwhelming love on the mother's face as her baby was finally placed into her arms. These were the moments that surely fueled the midwife's endurance, moments of quiet victory against overwhelming odds. The touch of the newborn's soft, unblemished skin, the delicate curl of its fingers around your own, a precious, fleeting sensation amidst the grit and hardship of their everyday existence. Beyond the intimate sphere of birth, there were small, personal moments that offered respite, perhaps a rare, quiet evening by your own humble hearth, the comforting scent of wood smoke filling your home, the gentle crackle of flames providing a fleeting sense of warmth and security, or a shared meal with your own family, the simple taste of coarse bread and a hearty stew, feeling like a lavish feast after a day of intense physical labor or emotional strain. These small respites were not luxuries, they were essential fragments of normalcy, moments of connection and sustenance that allowed individuals to gather strength and continue. For a woman in medieval society, where opportunities were incredibly limited and where social mobility was often a distant dream, the role of midwife, despite its immense difficulties, offered a unique path to social standing and a profound purpose. It was a profession almost exclusively for women, giving them a domain of undeniable power and responsibility within a largely patriarchal world. They were the keepers of vital knowledge, the first hands to touch new life, and often the last hope for mothers and infants in crisis. This profound sense of purpose and indispensable service must have been a deep motivator, a quiet strength that sustained them through the fear, the grief, and the never ending demands. Their legacy wasn't necessarily written in grand histories or etched in stone monuments. Instead, it lived on in the families they helped create, in the children who survived and thrived because of their tireless efforts, in the very continuation of human life itself. It's a testament to human resilience, to the quiet heroism of countless individuals who faced overwhelming odds with unwavering dedication. What a remarkable balance between harsh reality and the profound dignity of their essential, life giving work. Their unseen legacy echoes through time, a gentle reminder of the strength found in serving others. Conclusion: a day you wouldn't survive. And just like that, we've gently journeyed through a day, or perhaps more accurately, a deep dive into the entire fabric of life in medieval times. It's a reality that was truly defined by relentless hardship, by the constant struggle against unseen dangers, and by a profound weight of challenges with almost no real tools to bear it. We've seen how the very rhythms of life and rest were entirely alien, from segmented sleep to workdays dictated by the sun, demanding physical endurance and practical skills that our modern lives have rendered obsolete. The air itself, thick with the smells of wood smoke and manure, and the omnipresent threat of invisible pests, painted a vivid picture of constant discomfort. We also explored the truly staggering lack of medical knowledge they operated with. Imagine having only abstract diagrams to understand the complexities of the human body, or no concept whatsoever of germ. Every single touch could unknowingly spread deadly infection, a horrifying gamble that was simply part of their everyday reality. Their reliance on humors, prayers, and rudimentary methods highlights the immense gap in understanding between their era and our own. And then, the pervasive unsanitary conditions of medieval living, from communal spaces shared with animals to streets laden with waste. This environment was literally a breeding ground for disease, a constant assault on the senses, and a perpetual threat to life. The lack of privacy would be a profound psychological shock, stripping away the solitude and personal space we take for granted. Finally, we touched upon the brutal societal structure, where individual rights and social mobility were severely limited. The heavy, invisible chains of a predetermined life would chafe at a modern spirit, leading to deep frustration and a profound sense of powerlessness. Perhaps now you have a much clearer understanding of why a modern individual, accustomed to the comforts and freedoms of our time, would truly find existence in medieval Europe a horrifying, impossible experience. The sheer physical, emotional, and psychological toll from the constant exposure to disease and death, to the lack of effective solutions and the ever present threat of societal condemnation and arbitrary control, would render daily life utterly unbearable. Indeed, a modern person would truly not last a single day in medieval times before seeking a swift return to the comforts of their own era. Thank you for joining me on this gentle, yet unvarnished, historical journey tonight. Thank you for lending your precious time to listen and to ponder the incredible resilience of those who came before us. They truly endured in ways we can barely imagine. I hope these quiet explorations have offered you a moment of peace and a gentle passage into slumber. Now, let these thoughts slowly dissolve, like wisps of smoke from an ancient hearth, drifting into the stillness of the quiet night. Let the faint echoes of unseen struggles and untold courage guide you into a deep, peaceful sleep. Sweet dreams, and may your rest be truly undisturbed.